The Magic Scroll. Part 1, The Scroll. Prologue. The rain over the city of Lyon was not a cleansing mist but a greasy, persistent drizzle that seemed to leach the very color from the world. It turned the timbered upper stories of the houses a slick, dark brown and made rivers of mud in the cobbled streets, where the refuse of 1,000 lives swam in a foul broth. The year was 1349, and a shadow longer than any cast by the setting sun lay across France. The great mortality, the Black Death, had passed through like the scythe of a wrathful god, leaving hollowed-out villages and a city half-mad with grief and survivor's guilt. In its wake, a new kind of desperation festered, one born not of plague, but of the crushing realization that life, for all its fragility, could also be a relentless and unforgiving burden. It was in this state that Eleonora of Montargis found herself, a young woman of 22 whose spirit had been scoured down to the bone. She was not a native of Lyon. She had come from a minor noble family whose lands and fortunes had been utterly annihilated by the pestilence, their small castle now a tomb watched over by crows. The last of her line, she had fled to the city with a few tarnished silver spoons and the desperate hope of finding a position, any position, that would spare her the final humiliation of begging or the slower death of starvation. But Lyon, though wounded, was a mercantile city, its heart beating to the rhythm of the coin purse, not the heraldic crest. Its guilds of weavers and bankers had no use for a gently bred woman with no dowry, no connections, and hands too soft for labor. Her education in Latin, embroidery, and music was a currency no one would accept. For weeks, she had been a ghost drifting through the crowded markets and narrow alleys, her once fine woolen cloak now threadbare and stained, her shoes letting in the icy water. She had been turned away from convents that were overfull with widows and orphans, and from the households of lesser nobles who saw in her gaunt, proud face not a potential companion, but a reminder of their own precarious station. Tonight, the last of her coins had been spent on a crust of stale bread. The landlord of the wretched boarding house near the Saône River, a man with eyes like curdled milk and breath smelling of cheap wine, had made it clear that her welcome, and her credit, had expired. His offer of an alternative method of payment had been explicit, his hand bruising on her arm. She had wrenched herself away, fleeing into the wet, indifferent darkness. Now, she stood on the Pont de Saône, the ancient Roman bridge, and watched the swollen, black waters churn below. The lights from the houses on the opposite bank wavered in the rain, mocking imitations of warmth and safety. The urge to climb onto the stone parapet and let the current take her was a palpable pull, a seductive whisper in the roar of the river. It would be so easy. An end to the cold, the hunger, the shame. An end to the terrifying emptiness of a future that held nothing. But a stubborn ember of pride, the last inheritance from her father, flared within her. She would not give the vile landlord or this cruel city the satisfaction. If she was to die, it would not be by her own hand in a moment of despair. She would find a different end. She turned her back on the river and plunged once more into the labyrinthine streets, her path aimless, guided only by a perverse desire to delay the inevitable. She found herself in a quarter of the city she did not know, a warren of overhanging buildings so close they nearly kissed overhead, shutting out the bruised twilight sky. The air smelled of damp stone, forgotten spices, and something else, the faint, acrid scent of old parchment and metal. The shops here were not like the bustling, open-fronted stalls of the cloth merchants. They were dark, recessed holes, their windows filled with strange, unidentifiable objects. One shop, in particular, drew her eye. There was no sign above its low, ogival door, which was blackened with age and studded with iron nails. In the small, thick-glassed window, a single object was displayed on a frayed velvet cushion, an astrolabe of tarnished brass, its intricate calibration speaking of a forgotten precision. Something about the absolute stillness of the place, its air of existing outside of time, called to the stillness within her. It was a place for endings. Perhaps it held one for her. Pushing the heavy door, which swung inward without a sound, Eleonora stepped into the antiquary's lair. The interior was a cave of time. It was not merely a shop but a vast, rambling cavern of a room, its ceiling lost in shadow. Every inch of space was occupied, every surface buried. Piles of moth-eaten tapestries depicting forgotten battles leaned against stacks of rusted crusader armor. Glass-fronted cabinets were crammed with celestial globes, their seas faded, and with collections of Roman coins, green with verdigris. Books bound in cracked leather and chained to their shelves stood next to bizarre zoological specimens, a stuffed two-headed lamb under a glass dome, a crocodile suspended from the rafters, its jaw agape in a perpetual, leathery scream. The air was thick with the dust of centuries and the smell of decay, not the rot of flesh, but the slow, patient dissolution of wood, vellum, and memory. And in the midst of this chaos, seated on a high stool behind a counter cluttered with magnifying glasses, scales, and fragments of pottery, was the antiquary himself. He was so ancient he seemed to be made of the same material as his wares. His skin was like wrinkled parchment, stretched taut over a skull that was nearly bald save for a few wisps of white hair. His eyes, however, were alarmingly alive, 2 points of brilliant, cynical intelligence that took in Eleonora's bedraggled form in a single, comprehensive glance. He did not speak, merely waited, his long, skeletal fingers steepled before him. I was merely looking, Eleonora said, her voice hoarse from disuse and the damp. No one merely looks in here, the antiquary replied, his voice a dry rustle, like pages turning. They come seeking. Sometimes they do not even know what it is they seek until they find it. What is it you wish to escape, my child? The cold? Or the future? His perception was so unnerving it stripped away her pretense. She saw no point in lying to this living relic. Both, she whispered. He nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed some vast and sorrowful theorem of human existence. The cold is a temporary discomfort. The future, that is a more complex matter. Men and women spend their lives trying to shape it, to demand answers from it. They crave power, love, riches. They believe these things will fill the void within them. He gestured around the cluttered room. Everything you see here is a testament to that futile desire. The armor of a king who sought to conquer death through glory. The love sonnets of a poet who believed he could capture passion in ink. All dust. All forgotten. The desire remains, eternal and insatiable, but the objects of it are as fleeting as breath on a mirror. He leaned forward, his intense eyes holding hers. What if you could have that power? Not the petty power of a title or a chest of gold, but the true power to shape reality itself to your will? To command fate? Eleonora gave a bitter, choked laugh. A fairy tale for children. There is no such power. Oh, but there is, he whispered. He moved with an unnerving agility, slipping off his stool and disappearing into the deeper shadows of the shop. He returned moments later carrying a small, iron-bound casket. Setting it on the counter, he produced a heavy key from within his robes and unlocked it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black silk, was a scroll. It was not large, perhaps the length of a man's forearm. The parchment was a dark, smoky brown, cracked with age at the edges. It was tied with a cord of what looked like human hair, sealed with a lump of black wax impressed with a symbol she did not recognize, a serpent swallowing its own tail. This, the antiquary said, his voice dropping to a reverent hush, is the Urim scroll. It is older than any empire, older than any god mankind currently worships. It contains the last words of a civilization that understood the fundamental algebra of the universe, the balance between desire and life. Eleonora felt a cold dread prickle her skin, yet she could not look away. What does it do? It grants the wish of its possessor. Any wish. From the most trivial to the most profound. Wealth, love, revenge, power, name your heart's desire, and the universe will bend to accommodate it. A wild, impossible hope flared in her chest, so painful it was like a knife wound. Then, just as quickly, it died. And the price? She asked, her voice steady. She had learned that nothing in this world was given freely. The antiquary's thin lips stretched into a smile that held no warmth. Ah, you are wiser than most who have held it. The price is the one thing we all believe we have in infinite supply, until we suddenly do not. Life itself. The scroll is the physical manifestation of your vital force. With every wish you make, it will shrink. As it shrinks, so too does the span of your days. Each fulfillment is a mortgage paid with your allotted time on earth. You may have all you desire, but you will have no future in which to enjoy it. It is the most perfect of contracts, desire and death, inextricably linked. He pushed the casket toward her. I offer it to you. Take it. Or leave it. My role is merely to be the guardian of the choice. Eleonora stared at the small, sinister object. It was madness. A trick. The ravings of an old man who had spent too long among dead things. And yet, what did she have to lose? A life of begging? Of selling her body to a repulsive landlord? A slow, grinding descent into the grave? That was also a death of the spirit, a daily shrinking of her world. If this was true, she could choose a different death. A brilliant, spectacular flash of life, however brief, instead of this interminable gray drizzle. She could have vengeance on a world that had scorned her. She could know warmth, luxury, power, if only for a moment. Her hand trembled as she reached out. Her fingers, cold and numb, brushed against the ancient parchment. A jolt, like a spark of static, passed through her. She did not hesitate further. She took the scroll. I accept, she said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. The antiquary nodded, his ancient eyes filled with a bottomless pity. So it begins. Remember, the wish must be spoken aloud, and the scroll must be in your hand. There are no limits to its power, only to the time you have left to wield it. Use it, judiciously. Clutching the iron casket to her chest, Eleonora turned and fled the shop, back out into the rain-swept night. She was no longer a ghost. She was a woman holding a bomb. And the fuse was now lit. The scroll. The garret room Eleonora rented for her last few coins was a bleak cell under the eaves of a leaning house. The wind whistled through gaps in the plaster, and the smell of boiled cabbage from the floor below was a constant, suffocating presence. But for the first time since entering it, Eleonora did not feel its oppressive misery. She sat on the narrow pallet, the iron casket on her knees, and stared at the scroll within. The Urim scroll. It looked so innocuous, a simple piece of old skin. Could it truly hold the power the antiquary had claimed? The rational part of her mind, the part educated by monks and logic, scoffed. It was superstition, a delusion for the desperate. But another, deeper, more primal part of her felt its potency. It seemed to hum with a silent energy, a patient, hungry waiting. She untied the cord of hair, a shudder went through her at the thought of its origin, and broke the black wax seal. The serpent symbol crumbled to dust. With a breath she did not realize she was holding, she unrolled the parchment. The script inside was like nothing she had ever seen. It was not Latin, nor Greek, nor Arabic. The characters were angular, stark, and seemed to writhe on the page if she stared at them too long. They were not ink, but something darker, something that seemed to have been burned into the parchment itself. They spoke of a terrifying, ancient knowledge, a language of pure will. She could not read it, but she understood its intent. It was a contract. The terms were clear, a wish for a life. What should she wish for? Gold? Enough to never want again? But gold could be stolen. Power? To be a countess? A duchess? But power in this world was held by men, through birthright and arms. A sudden, unexplained elevation would raise questions, suspicions of witchcraft. No, her first wish had to be something immediate, something that would provide a foundation for all that was to come. It had to be unassailable, legitimate, and hers alone. An idea, brilliant and terrible, began to form in her mind. Her father had often spoken of a distant, obscure branch of their family, the de Montargis, who had once held a vast tract of land in the Languedoc, lands that had been lost generations ago in some forgotten legal dispute. The records were murky, the claim tenuous at best, a story told to children to remind them of past glories. She would wish for that. Not just the wealth, but the right to it. The legitimacy. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The point of no return. To speak the wish was to accept the bargain, to acknowledge the shrinking of her life. She thought of the river, of the landlord's grasping hands, of the gnawing emptiness in her belly. This was not a choice. It was the only choice. She took the scroll in her hand. The parchment felt strangely warm, almost alive. She closed her eyes, and in a clear, firm voice that echoed in the tiny room, she spoke her desire to the universe. I wish to be the sole, legal, and undisputed heir to the entire estate and titles of the House of de Montargis of Languedoc, with all its lands, incomes, and historical rights, recognized by all of society and the crown. The effect was instantaneous. The scroll grew hot in her hand, searing her palm with a pain that was sharp and clean. A light, not of the sun or fire, but a cold, violet-hued energy, flashed from the characters on the page, illuminating the squalid room in a brief, apocalyptic glare. The air crackled with ozone and a sound like 1,000 distant whispers. Eleonora cried out and nearly dropped it. As the light faded, she looked down. The scroll had visibly shrunk. A finger's width of parchment at the bottom was now blank, the ancient writing having retreated upward. The contract had been executed. The contract had been executed. The price had been paid. For a long moment, nothing happened. Silence. The wind still whistled. The smell of cabbage still lingered. A crushing disappointment began to well up inside her. It had been a trick. A cruel, magnificent trick. She had traded a portion of her life for nothing but a heavy fist pounded on her door, making her jump. "Milady! Milady Eleonora," a voice boomed. It was the landlord, but his tone was utterly transformed. The leering menace was gone, replaced by a frantic, obsequious panic. Trembling, she hid the scroll in the casket and shoved it under her pallet. She opened the door a crack. The landlord stood there, wringing his hands. Behind him, crowding the narrow hallway, were 3 men. The first was a royal herald, his tabard bearing the fleur-de-lis of France, his expression one of bored impatience. The second was a man in the rich, somber robes of a magistrate. The third was a knight in full mail, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. "Milady Eleonora de Montargis," the herald intoned, consulting a scroll of his own, this one bearing a large, official seal. She could only nod, her throat constricted. "By order of His Majesty, King Philip VI, and by the ruling of the High Court of Paris, you are hereby recognized as the sole and rightful heir of Félix de Montargis, your kinsman. His estates in Languedoc, his titles, and all properties and revenues therein, are now vested in you. We are here to escort you to appropriate lodgings and to begin the management of your affairs." The magistrate stepped forward, bowing slightly. "A most remarkable case, my lady. Documents unknown for generations have suddenly come to light in the royal archives. A lost will, marriage certificates, it is nothing short of miraculous. Your claim is absolute." The world swam before Eleonora's eyes. It was real. The scroll was real. She was no longer Eleonora the destitute. She was the Lady Eleonora de Montargis, a landed noblewoman of significant means. A wild, almost hysterical laugh bubbled up in her chest, but she suppressed it. She drew herself up to her full height, the innate nobility that had been suppressed by hunger and fear now radiating from her. She looked at the gawking landlord, who seemed to be trying to shrink into the wall. "You may go," she said to him, her voice icy and calm. "I will send for my things." The dismissal was absolute, a world of power in 3 sentences. As she followed the herald and the knight down the rickety stairs, leaving her old life behind in the stinking garret, 2 emotions warred within her, a soaring, ecstatic triumph that made her feel invincible, and a cold, leaden horror as she remembered the feel of the scroll shrinking in her hand. She had gotten everything she had wished for. And she had paid for it with a piece of her soul. The first wish. The next days were a whirlwind, a waking dream of astonishing reversal. Eleonora was installed in a spacious townhouse belonging to a merchant who was, conveniently, away on business and apparently more than willing to accommodate the sudden wishes of the crown. Chests of clothing appeared, gowns of silk, velvet, and fine wool, far finer than anything she had ever owned. A retinue was assembled, a stern-faced chatelaine, maids, a steward to manage her sudden wealth, and guards wearing her new livery, a silver eagle on a field of azure, the resurrected arms of de Montargis. She stood in the main hall of the townhouse, warming her hands by a roaring fire in a great stone fireplace. She was wearing a deep blue gown that matched her eyes, its sleeves lined with miniver. The weight of the fabric, its softness against her skin, was an almost sensual pleasure after the rough, damp wool of her previous existence. A servant entered silently and offered her a goblet of spiced wine. She took it, the silver cool against her fingers. This was power. Not the abstract power she had imagined, but the simple, profound power of warmth, of comfort, of command. A word from her, and the fire was built. A glance, and the wine was brought. It was a symphony of obedience, and she was the conductor. Her steward, a dry, efficient man named Master Thibault, unrolled ledgers on a heavy oak table. "The estates are extensive, my lady. Vineyards, which produce a passable wine. Wheat fields. A quarry. And the primary holding, the Château de Montargis itself. It has been neglected for some years, but its walls are sound. The annual income is substantial." He named a figure that made Eleonora's head swim. It was a fortune beyond her childhood dreams, a sum that could have saved her father 10 times over. "We must send a party to secure the castle and begin repairs," she said, trying to sound as if she had been giving such orders all her life. "It is already done, my lady," Thibault replied with a slight bow. "I took the liberty." Of course he had. The machinery of wealth was self-perpetuating. It had its own momentum, and she was now its center. That evening, she was invited to dine at the house of the Comte de Laval, one of the most powerful nobles in the region. Her story, the miraculous rediscovery of a lost heiress, had spread through the city like wildfire. She was a novelty, a romance made flesh. The Count's hall was vast, ablaze with 100 candles. Tapestries depicting hunting scenes covered the walls, and the long trestle tables groaned under the weight of roasted swans, venison pastries, and towers of sweetmeats. Eleonora was placed near the high table. She saw the looks she received, curiosity from the women, appraisal from the men. She was beautiful, she knew, in a pale, intense way that her time of hardship had only sharpened. But now her beauty was framed by wealth and mystery, making it utterly compelling. The Comte de Laval, a florid man with a booming laugh, toasted her. To the Lady Eleonora. May the house of de Montargis be long restored to its former glory. The hall echoed with the sentiment. To the Lady Eleonora. As she raised her own goblet, her eyes scanned the room. They locked with a pair of deep, thoughtful brown eyes from across the hall. The man was young, perhaps a few years older than her, with a strong, clean-shaven face and the broad shoulders of a warrior. He wore the simple but well-made tunic of a knight in the service of a greater lord. He wasn't smiling with the others, his expression was one of intense, almost puzzled recognition. A jolt went through her. Sir Roland de Clermont. She had known him years ago, when their families had neighboring lands. He had been a squire then, earnest and kind. He had once given her a ribbon from his sleeve after she had admired it. She had cherished it for a year. There had been a fragile, unspoken thing between them, a possibility that had been extinguished by the plague and her family's fall. He recognized her. Not as the mythical heiress, but as the girl he had known. His gaze was a tether to her past, to a self that felt 1,000,000 miles away. She quickly looked down, her heart pounding. It was one thing to be admired by strangers, another to be truly seen by someone who knew the truth of her obscurity. Later, as musicians played and the guests began to dance, he approached her. He bowed, his movements precise and graceful. "My lady," he said, his voice deeper than she remembered. "Forgive my forwardness, but, is it truly you? Eleonora of—" "I knew a family by that name, near Amboise." She met his gaze, her social mask firmly in place. "The world is full of echoes, Sir Knight. My family had many branches. Perhaps you knew a distant cousin." The lie tasted like ash, but she could not, would not, admit the truth. The scroll had given her this new history, and she must live it utterly. He studied her face for a moment longer, and she saw the doubt in his eyes, but also a flicker of hope. "Perhaps," he conceded. "Yet the resemblance is uncanny. She was a girl of great spirit. I heard she was lost to the pestilence. I am glad to see that rumor was false." He asked her to dance. It was a slow, stately measure. His hand was warm and firm on hers. As they moved through the steps, he spoke of the recent tournaments, of the politics of the court in Paris, of his hope to win renown and a place of his own. He was everything this new world represented: honor, strength, straightforward ambition. Being near him felt both exhilarating and terrifying. He was the one thing in this glittering illusion that felt real. When the dance ended, he bowed again. "I am stationed at the royal garrison here for the winter, my lady. I would be honored if I might call upon you." "I would like that," she said, and found that she meant it. That night, back in the bedchamber of her new home, a room with a real feather bed and a window of actual glass, she took out the iron casket. The servants had brought her few possessions from the garret, and this, she had insisted, was a private trinket box of sentimental value. She unrolled the Urim scroll. The sight made her breath catch. It was significantly smaller. A quarter of the parchment was now blank, the mysterious script confined to the top portion. The price for her vast wealth and title had been steep. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. How much time had that one wish cost her? A year? 5 years? 10? She traced the edge of the blank space, a boundary between life and death. The horror was real, a constant, silent companion beneath the glitter and the admiration. Yet, as she lay in the unimaginable softness of her bed, listening to the secure sound of a guard pacing outside her door, she could not bring herself to regret it. This was better than the river. This was better than the garret. Even a single day of this life was worth a decade of the one she had left behind. She had taken the first step on a new path. She had wealth, status, and the promise of seeing Roland again. The world was finally yielding to her will. But the means of that yield lay in her hands, a sleeping monster that grew hungrier with every feeding. A new path. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in social alchemy. Eleonora, the unknown, poverty-stricken orphan, was seamlessly transmuted into the Lady Eleonora de Montargis, the enigmatic and captivating heiress. Lyon's high society, a complex ecosystem of old money, noble blood, and mercantile ambition, opened its doors to her. She was invited to masses in the great cathedral, to hawking parties in the countryside, to intimate literary salons hosted by wealthy burghers' wives who were desperate for a whiff of nobility. She learned quickly. Her natural intelligence, sharpened by desperation, allowed her to mimic the manners and speech of the aristocracy. She learned which subjects to discuss, the poetry of Chrétien de Troyes, the latest fashions from Burgundy, and which to avoid, the lingering stench of the plague pits, the increasingly desperate war with England. She learned to deploy a faint, mysterious smile that suggested depths of knowledge and sorrow, a look that fascinated the jaded courtiers around her. She also learned the politics of it all. The old nobility, like the Comte de Laval, saw her as a useful new player, unaligned with any of the existing factions, a fresh stream into their stagnant pond. The wealthy merchants saw her as a bridge to the aristocratic world they coveted. The churchmen, particularly a lean and hawk-faced Dominican monk named Brother Clement, who was the confessor to many powerful families, watched her with a speculative, unnerving stillness, as if trying to discern the source of her sudden radiance. And through it all, there was Roland. He called upon her, as promised. Their conversations, initially guarded, soon fell into an easy familiarity. He spoke of his life with a frankness she found refreshing. He was a second son, with no inheritance to look forward to. His future depended entirely on his skill at arms and his ability to attract the patronage of a great lord. He spoke of his dreams of earning a reputation for valor, of perhaps being granted a small keep on the borders of someone else's land. "I want something that is truly mine," he told her one afternoon as they walked in the walled garden of her townhouse. "Not through birth, but through my own effort. To build something that will last." His words struck a deep chord within her. He saw through honest effort what she had gained through a demonic pact. The comparison filled her with a shame that she quickly buried under a layer of practiced charm. "You will have it, Roland," she said, placing a hand lightly on his arm. "I am certain of it. A man of your honor cannot long be overlooked." He covered her hand with his own, his calloused fingers gentle. "Your faith heartens me, my lady. More than you know." She could feel the possibility between them, a tangible force. The girl she had been would have thrilled at it. The woman she was now calculated it. A marriage to Roland would be a good one. He was respected, handsome, and his rising star would be bolstered by her wealth, while his legitimacy would cement her place in society. It was a practical, even desirable, match. And she did feel a genuine pull towards him, a memory of a simpler, cleaner emotion. But the scroll whispered of other possibilities. Why settle for a knight and a small keep? Why not a duke? A prince? The power she held was absolute. She could wish for Roland to love her madly, irrevocably. She could wish to be the most powerful woman in France. The intoxicating lure of more was the scroll's true voice, and it was always there, a seductive murmur at the edge of her consciousness. She hosted a small feast of her own, a declaration of her arrival. The hall was hung with her new tapestries. Minstrels played. The food was extravagant, peacock roasted and redressed in its feathers, a subtlety of spun sugar shaped like her silver eagle crest. She sat at the head of the table, playing the hostess with a grace that felt both innate and painfully acquired. Roland was there, his eyes shining with admiration. Brother Clement was also there, seated near her. He ate little, drank less, and spent the evening observing the room, his sharp eyes missing nothing. At one point, he leaned toward her, his voice a low, confidential murmur that cut through the laughter and music. "A most remarkable ascent, my lady. Truly, God works in mysterious ways. To raise one so young, so untainted by the world, to such a station. It must be a heavy burden." Eleonora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft in the hall. His tone was polite, but his eyes were interrogating her. "God's will is often a mystery, brother," she replied smoothly. "I can only strive to be worthy of it." "Of course," he said, a thin smile playing on his lips. Worthiness. A fascinating concept. Is it something we are born with, or something we acquire? The conversation was interrupted by a toast, but the monk's words lingered. He suspected something. He saw the improbability of her situation and was not satisfied with the official story. He was a man who dealt in souls and sins, and he sensed a transaction of a different kind had taken place. That night, alone again, she consulted the scroll. It had not shrunk further. The price was only taken for a conscious, actively spoken wish. Her mere existence in this state of luxury was not a continual drain, it was the consequence of the one, terrible payment she had already made. She held the parchment, its size a constant, grim reminder. The path ahead was dazzling, filled with light and admiration. But it was also a tightrope stretched over an abyss. On one side was Roland, representing a genuine, perhaps redeemable future. On the other was the bottomless ambition the scroll offered, and the calculating gaze of men like Brother Clement. And beneath it all was the steadily diminishing length of the parchment, the silent, ticking clock of her own life. She had chosen her path. Now she had to walk it, knowing every step was bringing her closer to the end. Part 2, The Heartless Woman. Rising Fortune. Eleonora's ascent was no longer a topic of gossip, it became an accepted, dazzling fact of Lyon's social landscape. The initial whispers of suspicion, that she was an impostor, a clever adventuress, were drowned out by the sheer weight of her wealth and the royal seal on her legitimacy. Gold was the ultimate alchemist, transmuting doubt into deference. She mastered the art of her new existence with a ruthless precision that would have shocked the girl from the garret. Under Master Thibault's tutelage, she learned to read a ledger not as columns of numbers, but as a map of influence. She saw how a loan to a struggling knight could buy loyalty, how a generous donation to the cathedral chapter could silence critical tongues, and how the purchase of a shipment of Flemish wool could indebt a powerful guild master. Her mind, once occupied with thoughts of bread and shelter, now calculated compound interest and political alliances. She received a stream of visitors in her solar, a sunlit room overlooking the city. Tailors presented bolts of cloth from Damascus and Constantinople. Jewelers laid out pearls and sapphires on velvet trays. Architects and master masons arrived with plans for the restoration of Château de Montargis, speaking of grand halls, glazed windows, and fortified walls. With a nod of her head, she could set 100 men to work. With a stroke of a quill, she could change the fortunes of a village. Her fame spread beyond Lyon. Troubadours, hearing of the beautiful, mysterious heiress, began to compose songs about La Dame de Montargis, attributing to her a tragic past and a heart guarded by ice, waiting for the perfect night to thaw it. These ballads both amused and irritated her. They were based on a fantasy, a romantic archetype. They knew nothing of the iron casket hidden in a chest by her bed, nothing of the cold calculus that now governed her heart. She was admired by counts and envied by their wives. She learned to parry the subtle verbal thrusts of noblewomen who saw her as a threat to their daughters' marriage prospects. She learned to deflect the clumsy advances of older, widowed lords who saw her wealth as a convenient bolster to their own declining fortunes. She was a prize, and she knew it. But the scroll had given her a terrifying autonomy. She did not need to marry for security. She could marry for power. Or perhaps not marry at all. It was this very independence that made her so fascinating and so dangerous. She operated outside the established networks of obligation and blood. She was a new star in the feudal firmament, and no one was quite sure which constellation she belonged to. Feasts and splendor. The culmination of her social conquest was the tournament hosted in her honor by the Comte de Laval. It was a spectacle designed to showcase his own wealth and her status as his most illustrious guest. The fields outside the city walls were transformed into a canvas of vibrant color. Pavilions of silk, emblazoned with the coats of arms of a dozen noble houses, dotted the landscape like giant, brilliant flowers. The air thrummed with the sounds of hammer on steel, the neighing of destriers, the shouts of squires, and the melodies of minstrels. Eleonora sat in the place of honor on the reviewing stand next to the Comte and his lady, shaded by a canopy of crimson and gold. She was a vision in a gown of deep emerald green, a silver fillet holding a delicate veil upon her hair. On her finger was a massive ruby, a purchase she had made not for its beauty, but for the message it sent: I am unassailable. Below, the knights paraded. They were magnificent engines of war, their plate armor polished to a blinding sheen, their caparisons flowing to the ground, heraldic beasts roaring from their shields. They lowered their lances in salute to the Comte, and then, invariably, the points would dip further, aiming their respectful gesture at her. She was the queen of this pageant. And then Roland rode into the lists. He was not the most lavishly equipped knight, but he was perhaps the most impressive. His armor was functional, well worn at the joints, without frivolous ornamentation. His bearing was straight, his control of his powerful warhorse absolute. When he reined in before the stand, he lifted his visor. His eyes found hers, and he offered not just a salute, but a smile, a genuine, unguarded expression that stood in stark contrast to the formal posturing of the others. Her heart, which had been beating with the cool, measured rhythm of calculation, stumbled. In that moment, he was not Sir Roland de Clermont, a potential political asset. He was Roland, the boy who had given her a ribbon. The one person who looked at Eleonora de Montargis and seemed to see a ghost of the girl she had been. The jests began. The thunder of hooves, the sickening crack of lances on shields, the roar of the crowd, it was a violent, brutal ballet. Knights were unhorsed, men carted away with broken bones. It was a metaphor for the world she now inhabited, glorious on the surface, brutal beneath. Roland fought like a man possessed. He won his first pass, his lance striking true and sending his opponent tumbling into the dust. He won his second. With each victory, the crowd's cheers for him grew louder. He was the local hero. The knight of modest means showing up his wealthier rivals. Each time he prevailed, he would glance toward her, and a fierce, possessive pride bloomed in her chest. He reached the final, facing the Khan's own nephew, an arrogant young man with the finest armor money could buy. The two knights charged. The impact was tremendous. Both lances shattered into splinters. The Khan's nephew was thrown backward, landing with a crash of metal. Roland, though swaying in his saddle, remained mounted. The field was his. He was led before the reviewing stand to receive his prize. The Khan awarded him a purse of gold and a new sword. But then, following tradition, Roland was given the honor of naming the Queen of Love and Beauty. Every lady on the stand sat a little straighter. It was the highest accolade, a public declaration of devotion. The Comtesse smiled expectantly. Other young beauties fluttered their lashes. Roland did not even glance at them. His eyes, bright with triumph and adrenaline, were locked on Eleonora. He took the wreath of laurel and fresh flowers from the herald. "There is no beauty here that does not pale next to the lady who has brought light back to a darkened house," he proclaimed, his voice ringing clear across the silent field. "I named the Lady Eleonora de Montargis as my Queen of Love and Beauty." A collective gasp, then a wave of applause. It was a breathtakingly bold move. He was a landless knight crowning the wealthiest heiress in the region. It was either the height of romantic folly or the stroke of a political genius. Eleonora rose, her cheeks flushed. She allowed him to place the wreath upon her head. The flowers were sweet-smelling, their fragrance intoxicating. She looked down at his face, smudged with dust and sweat, alight with honest admiration, and felt the walls around her heart tremble. Love and passion. The feast that night was a riot of celebration. The great hall of the Khan's castle was packed with revelers, all paying homage to the victorious knight and his chosen queen. But for Eleonora and Roland, the crowd faded into a blur. They were the center of a shared, private universe. They danced, their movements speaking a language more eloquent than words. In the patterns of the dance, they were together, then apart, then together again, a perfect metaphor for the push and pull between them. During a slow, stately estampie, his hand on her waist was the only thing that felt real in the whirl of color and sound. "You were magnificent today," she said, her voice low. "I fought for you," he replied, his tone simple, direct. "Every pass. Every blow. The thought of you was my armor." The raw sincerity in his words undid her. This was not the flattery of courtiers who wanted something. This was a gift, freely given. She had built her new life on a foundation of magical deceit, but his feelings were real, earned through sweat and courage. They had a weight and a value that her scroll-bought riches could never approximate. He managed to steer her out onto a secluded balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens. The cool night air was a shock after the heat of the hall. The sounds of the feast were muted, replaced by the chirping of crickets. "Eleonora," he said, abandoning all formality. "This life you have, it is a miracle. But it is also a gilded cage. I see the way they look at you. They see a title, a fortune. They do not see you." Her breath caught. He saw too much. "And what do you see, Roland?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I see the girl from Amboise," he said, stepping closer. "I see a strength that has been tempered by fire. I see a woman who deserves more than to be a prize for some avaricious duke. You deserve a love that is fierce and true. You deserve a life that is your own." He cupped her face in his hands. His palms were rough from the reins and the sword, but his touch was infinitely gentle. "Let me give that to you. Not as the Lady de Montargis, but as Eleonora. and then he kissed her. It was not the kiss of a courtier claiming a favor. It was a vow, a promise, a claiming of something that had begun years ago on a sun-drenched field near Amboise. It was passion untainted by calculation, desire uncomplicated by magic. For the first time since unrolling the scroll, Eleonora felt not like an imposter, but like herself. She kissed him back, pouring all her loneliness, her fear, and her desperate hope into that single, perfect moment. Cold ambition. The intoxicating haze of the night was shattered the next morning by a visit from Brother Clement. He was shown into her solar, his black robe seeming to swallow the morning light. He did not bother with pleasantries. "A remarkable victory for your knight," he began, his voice like dry leaves scraping on stone. "A very public declaration. The talk of the city." Eleonora stiffened, her guard instantly raised. "Sir Roland fought with honor. He is a man of great virtue." "Virtue is a commendable quality in a knight," Clement agreed, his eyes boring into her. "But is it the most useful quality for the lady who now finds herself at the center of a web of power? The Duke of Burgundy's representative is in the city. He has asked about you. The king's own cousin, a man of immense influence, is without a wife. Their interest is not born of romantic ballads, my lady. It is born of strategy. Alliances with such men would make you not just a wealthy woman, but a power in the realm. A marriage to a landless knight, however virtuous, is a diminishment of your potential." He let the words hang in the air, cold and heavy. He was not merely offering advice, he was presenting her with a blueprint for ultimate power. The scroll had given her wealth, but it could not instantly grant her the deep-rooted political influence that came from marrying into the highest echelon of the nobility. That was a different kind of alchemy, one of blood and marriage contracts. "Sir Roland's prospects are limited," Clement continued mercilessly. "He offers you his heart, which is a pretty thing, but hearts are fragile. The Duke's cousin offers you a seat at the table where the fate of kingdoms is decided. Which is the wiser investment?" He was appealing directly to the part of her that had seized the scroll, the part that was ambitious, calculating, and hungry for security that could not be unraveled by a shrinking piece of parchment. Roland offered love, but love was a risk. It could fade, it could betray. The power Clement spoke of was tangible, concrete. She thought of the scroll. She could wish for Roland to be made a great lord. She could wish for his fortunes to rise to match her own. But the cost, the scroll was already so small. To use it again, for something as intangible as love, seemed a catastrophic waste of her dwindling life. Surely it was better to hoard what was left, to use it only for the most dire, strategic necessities? The monk saw her hesitation, the war between her heart and her ambition. A thin, satisfied smile touched his lips. "Do not decide hastily. Merely consider the geometry of power. Sentiment is a luxury those in our position can seldom afford." After he left, Eleonora was torn asunder. She touched her lips, still remembering the feel of Roland's kiss. Then she looked at her hands, imagining the weight of a duke's signet ring. One path led to a life of possible happiness, but also of vulnerability. The other led to a fortress of power, a life of immense influence, but likely devoid of the warmth she had felt in Roland's arms. The scroll had not just shortened her life, it had poisoned her choices. It had made the ambition it fed seem more real, more reliable, than the messy, unpredictable beauty of human love. The first cracks. The choice was made for her, not by decision, but by dread. A few days later, she awoke feeling unusually weary. A deep, bone-aching fatigue that a full night's sleep had not cured. She dismissed it as the excitement of the recent days. But then, as her maid was brushing her hair, she let out a small gasp. "My lady, a silver thread," she said, plucking a single, stark white hair from Eleonora's raven locks. Eleonora stared at it in the mirror. It seemed to glow with a malevolent light. It was nothing, she told herself. A sign of stress. Yet a cold finger of fear traced its way down her spine. That afternoon, practicing her penmanship, a sharp, stabbing pain shot through her wrist, so sudden she dropped the quill, spattering ink across the parchment. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving behind a dull throb. The signs were small, but to her, they were deafening. The price was not some abstract accounting to be settled in a distant future. It was being extracted now, from her very body. The scroll was hungry. In a panic, she locked her door and retrieved the iron casket. Her hands shook as she unrolled the Urim scroll. She cried out. It had shrunk again. Significantly. Since the tournament, since her nights dreaming of Roland and her days listening to Brother Clement, she had not made a conscious wish. Yet the parchment was now half its original size. The ancient script was crowded into the top portion, the blank space below a terrifying void. How? Why? And then she understood. The scroll was not a passive tool. It was an active, malevolent force. It fed on desire. Her conscious wish had set the terms of the contract, but her continued wanting, her ambition for more power, her yearning for Roland, was accelerating the process. Every covetous thought, every calculated daydream, was a tiny wish, a silent prayer to the demonic parchment, and it was consuming her life in tiny, invisible increments. The horror of it was absolute. She could not stop wanting. To stop wanting was to be dead already. Her very humanity, her hopes and dreams, were the fuel for her own destruction. A frantic, morbid energy seized her. If her life was burning away so quickly, she must achieve her ambitions faster. She must secure her power, make herself untouchable, before the last of the parchment vanished. The cautious approach was a luxury she could no longer afford. Love was a risk she could not take. It required a future, and she was no longer sure she had one. A joyless ball. She threw a ball in her own townhouse, a declaration of her solidified status. It was even more lavish than the Comte's feast. She hired musicians from Avignon, dancers from Italy. She had the floor strewn with precious herbs. A fountain in the courtyard ran with spiced wine. It was a spectacle of sheer, defiant opulence, a fortress of light and sound built to keep the creeping darkness at bay. She was the perfect hostess, glittering, charming, untouchable. She wore a gown of cloth of gold, and the ruby on her finger flashed like a droplet of blood. She danced with the Comte, with the Duke's representative, with wealthy merchants, her smile never wavering. But inside, she was hollow. The music was a meaningless jangle. The exquisite food tasted of ash. Every laugh sounded false, every compliment felt like a lie. She was watching herself from a great distance, a beautiful marionette going through the motions, while the real Eleonora was trapped in a tiny, shrinking room. Roland was there. He had been distant since the tournament, waiting for a sign from her, a confirmation of the passion they had shared on the balcony. He watched her now, his expression growing more concerned and confused as the night wore on. She was dazzling, but she was also cold, a brilliant diamond with no warmth at its core. He finally managed to claim a dance. As they moved together, his hand on her back felt like a brand. "Eleonora," he murmured, his voice full of concern. "What is it? What is wrong? You shine so brightly, but your eyes, they are elsewhere." She forced her social mask into place. "I am perfectly well, Sir Roland. merely tired from the preparations. The formality of Sir Roland was a deliberate wall. He would not be put off. This is not you. This performance. These people. What did that damned monk say to you? He has poisoned your mind. Brother Clement is a wise counselor, she said, her voice brittle. He understands the world. As I must. The dance ended. He held on to her hand for a moment too long, his grip firm. I understood the world on that balcony, he said, his voice low and intense. I understood us. Do not let them take that from you. Do not let you take that from you. He searched her face for any sign of the woman he had kissed. She offered him nothing but a polished, empty smile. The fear was too great. The sight of the shrinking scroll was burned into her mind. How could she promise him a future when hers was being measured in inches of parchment? His face fell. The hope in his eyes guttered and died. He released her hand as if it had burned him, bowed stiffly, and melted back into the crowd. She had succeeded in pushing him away. She had chosen the path of power, the path the scroll and Brother Clement had laid out for her. She stood alone amidst the swirling, laughing, drinking crowd, the queen of a magnificent castle built on sand, feeling the tide coming in. Shattered hopes. He came to see her the next day. She received him in the solar, the morning light cruelly exposing the faint shadows that had begun to form under her eyes. He did not sit. He stood before her, his posture that of a soldier reporting a defeat. I have received my orders, he said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual warmth. The garrison is being dispatched to the border. There are rumors of English mercenaries raiding in the south. We leave before week's end. It was a death knell. He was being sent away. Whether it was the machinations of Brother Clement or the Comte, who saw him as a complication, or simply the fortunes of war, it did not matter. The world was conspiring to confirm her choice. I see, Eleonora said, her hands clenched in her lap to stop him from trembling. You must go where your duty calls. Duty, he repeated the word as if it were a bitter taste. Yes. He took a deep breath. I came to ask you a question before I go. One last time, without pretense. He looked directly at her, and the pain in his eyes was unbearable. The woman on the balcony. The woman I fought for. Is she still there? Or was she just another phantom created by this, he gestured vaguely at the opulent room, this miracle of yours? It was her last chance. She could tell him everything. She could show him the scroll. She could throw herself on his mercy and his strength. They could flee together, try to outrun the curse. The thought was so powerful, so seductive, it nearly broke her. But then she saw it in her mind's eye, the shriveled scroll, the single white hair, the stabbing pain in her wrist. She was a condemned woman. To tie him to her would be to condemn him too. He would waste his life, his honor, trying to save a woman who was already dead. He would watch her wither away, and he would come to hate the thing she had become. Her love for him, in that moment, was the only real thing she had left. And because she loved him, she had to let him go. She had to make him hate her. She lifted her chin, summoning every ounce of her icy composure. The woman on the balcony was a fleeting fancy, Sir Roland. A moment of forgetfulness. I have responsibilities now. A name to uphold. A future to secure. There is no place in that future for romantic fictions. The words were knives, and she felt them cutting her own soul to ribbons as she spoke them. He flinched as if struck. All the light went out of his face. He nodded slowly, a terrible finality in the gesture. "I understand," he said, his voice a hollow echo. "I wish you joy of your future, my lady. May it be everything you desire." He bowed, turned on his heel, and walked out of the solar. He did not look back. Eleonora sat perfectly still, listening to the sound of his retreating footsteps fade away. It was the sound of her heart breaking. It was the sound of the last door closing. She had gotten what she wished for. She was safe. She was powerful. She was alone. And in the silence he left behind, she heard another sound, faint but inexorable, the silent, mocking rustle of the scroll, continuing to shrink. Part 3, Agony. Despair. The days after Roland's departure congealed into a single, long night of the soul. The townhouse, once a symbol of her triumphant escape, became a gilded mausoleum. The tapestries on the walls seemed to depict not hunting scenes, but her own futility. The laughter of her servants echoed hollowly, a mockery of the silence within her. She had achieved everything the scroll had promised: wealth, status, power, and freedom from the pathetic desires of the heart. She was the embodiment of cold ambition, and it was a freezing, desolate wasteland. The physical symptoms, once subtle hints, now declared themselves with brazen cruelty. The fatigue was a constant weight, a leaden cloak she could not remove. She took to her bed for hours each afternoon, but found no rest, only a twilight state of anxious half-sleep. The pains, sharp, fleeting stabs in her joints, became more frequent. One morning, she looked in her polished silver mirror and saw a stranger. Her famous raven hair was now streaked with distinct, shocking bands of silver at the temples. Her skin, once pale and smooth, had a papery, translucent quality, and the faint tracery of blue veins at her wrists seemed more pronounced, like rivers mapping a dying land. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. The scroll's hunger was no longer a metaphysical concept, it was a cancer, consuming her from the inside. She had to stop it. She had to find a way to break the contract. Her first thought was the church. It held the keys to salvation, the power to bind and loose, to exorcise demons. She went to the Cathedral of St. John, not as the proud heiress, but as a terrified supplicant. She sought an audience with the bishop himself, a man who had gladly accepted her donations for a new stained glass window. She knelt in the confessional, the scent of old wood and incense filling her lungs. Through the latticed screen, she poured out a carefully edited version of her sin. She spoke of a desperate bargain made in a moment of weakness, of a cursed object that had brought her worldly fortune at a terrible cost. She spoke of a shrinking talisman and her withering body. She did not name the scroll, framing it as a devil's charm. The bishop was silent for a long time after she finished. When he spoke, his voice was not filled with holy wrath or divine compassion, but with a weary, bureaucratic patience. "My child," he said, "the devil preys on the desperate with many tricks. Your guilt has conjured these phantoms. Your body suffers from melancholy, a common affliction of the noble spirit. The solution is prayer, penance, and a generous donation to show your contrition. The Lord forgives all who truly repent." He gave her a penance of 50 paternosters and 50 aves and dismissed her. He saw not a soul in peril, but a wealthy woman's hysterical guilt over a sudden windfall. He could not see the monster because he did not believe in its existence. To him, her despair was just another sin to be managed, another account to be balanced with prayer and gold. She left the cathedral feeling more damned than when she entered. If Holy Mother Church could not save her, then perhaps forbidden knowledge could. She disguised herself in a servant's coarse woolen cloak and ventured back into the squalid quarter where her damnation had begun. She sought not the antiquary, instinct told her he was merely a messenger, not a savior, but an alchemist she had heard whispers of, a man named Magnus who dwelled in a cellar near the tanneries, a man who was said to know the secrets of life and matter. His lair was a foul-smelling den cluttered with crucibles, alembics, and jars containing things she dared not identify. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and rotting eggs. Magnus himself was a stooped, yellow-skinned man with eyes red-rimmed from fumes. She showed him the scroll, holding it out with trembling hands. "Can you break its power?" she begged. "Can you transfer the curse? Lengthen the parchment?" He took it with greedy, stained fingers, his eyes alight with avaricious curiosity. He measured it, held it to a candle flame, which it did not catch, and even dripped a corrosive green liquid on a tiny corner, which sizzled but did not mark the ancient skin. "The craft is exquisite," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "The binding of will to substance, a sublime art, lost to us. I have never seen its like." He looked up at her, his gaze speculative. "I cannot break it. The contract is written in a language of primal will. But I might be able to replicate it. For a price, I could create a copy, attempt to divert the energy, to slow the drain." He was not interested in saving her, he was interested in dissecting the magic, in possessing it for himself. He saw her not as a person, but as the source of a fascinating specimen. Horrified, she snatched the scroll back from him and fled, his disappointed calls echoing after her. She was utterly alone. The institutions of man and God were useless. The pursuit of knowledge was a dead end. The contract was absolute. The scroll's justice was perfect, and it was merciless. Fruitless seeking. A desperate, logical thought occurred to her. If wanting fueled the scroll, then perhaps the opposite could starve it. If she could renounce desire, extinguish all ambition and passion, maybe the process would halt. She would become an empty vessel, a neutral entity upon which the curse had no purchase. She resolved to try. She dismissed her lavish retinue, keeping only a single, ancient, half-deaf maid who asked no questions. She moved out of the townhouse and into a sparse, whitewashed cell of a room in a quiet religious hospice. She gave away her fine clothes and jewels to the poor, an act that caused a citywide sensation. She ate plain bread, drank water, and spent her days in forced meditation, trying to scour her mind clean of want. She would sit for hours, staring at the wall, chanting to herself, "I want nothing. I need nothing. I am nothing." But the world would not let her be nothing. Master Thibault tracked her down, his ledgers in hand, full of urgent questions about estate management, tenant disputes, investment opportunities. A message arrived from the Duke's cousin, expressing concern for her health and a renewed interest in a potential alliance. The world she had built with her wish continued to operate, a vast, complex machine that demanded the attention of its creator. Worse than the external world was the rebellion within. Her body, trained to luxury, craved the softness of a feather bed, the taste of spiced wine. Her mind, sharpened by strategy, itched to solve the problems Thibault presented. And her heart, though she tried to bury it, ached for Roland with a pain that was physical. Lying on her hard pallet at night, she would see his face. She would feel the ghost of his hand on hers, the memory of his kiss. She would imagine a different life, a modest manor house, children with his eyes, a life built not on magic but on mutual respect and effort. The want for him, for that lost possibility, would rise in her throat like a sob, and she would feel a corresponding pang in her body, a faint but unmistakable tremor of decay. She could not escape her own humanity. To want nothing was to be dead. Her attempt at asceticism was the greatest farce of all. After 2 weeks of this self-imposed torture, she looked at the scroll. It was smaller still. The effort of not wanting was itself a form of desire, a desperate, clawing desire for oblivion, and the scroll fed on it just the same. The curse was not in the object, it was in the act of possession itself. To own it was to be condemned to want. And to want was to die. She rolled the diminished scrap of parchment up, her fingers brushing against what little remained. There was only one path left. The last meeting. News came to her, even in her retreat. Sir Roland had returned from the border. His company had routed the mercenaries. He had fought with legendary bravery, saving the life of his commander. He was to be rewarded with a small but significant fiefdom of his own, a knight's holdfast with its own village and incomes. The landless knight was landless no more. The irony was so perfect it was cruel. He had achieved through valor and patience the very legitimacy she had tried to offer him through her coldness. He had built his future, just as he said he would. And he had done it without a magical contract. She had to see him. She didn't know what she hoped for, forgiveness, understanding, or perhaps just to sear the image of his wholeness into her mind as a final testament to the life she had forfeited. She put on a simple, dark gown and a veil and went to the church where it was said he would be giving thanks for his safe return. She waited in the shadows of a pillar as the mass ended. The congregation filtered out, and then he emerged into the afternoon light of the porch. He looked older, harder. The boyish hope had been chiseled away by war, leaving a man of grim resolve and quiet strength. He was whole, healthy, radiant with a life lived and earned. He saw her. His steps faltered. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, not the old admiration, not the hurt of betrayal, but a profound and weary shock. He walked over to her. "My lady," he said, the title a formal and immense distance between them. "Roland," she whispered. "I heard of your victory. I am glad for you." He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw him register the silver in her hair, the new lines of strain around her mouth, the faint tremor in her hands. The vibrant beauty that had captivated him was still there, but it was now like a perfect painting left out in the rain, its colors blurred and bleeding, its canvas warped. "What has happened to you?" he asked, his voice low and horrified. The anger was gone, replaced by a dawning, awful comprehension. "You are ill." She offered him a frail smile. "The world is a heavy place, Sir Roland." He shook his head, his brow furrowed. "This is more than that. Eleonora, tell me. Let me help you." Whatever it is, his instinct to protect, to serve, was still there, a knight to his core. For a wild moment, she considered it. To tell him everything. But what would it accomplish? He would pity her. He might even try to save her. But he could not. He would only watch her die, and the sight would poison his hard-won happiness. He would remember her not as the woman he once loved, but as a tragic, cursed figure. She could not do that to him. Her final act of love would be to let him believe the lie. To let him think her a cold, ambitious woman who had gotten what she deserved. "There is nothing to tell," she said, her voice regaining a shred of its old, icy composure. "And there is nothing you can do. My path is my own. Go to your new lands, Roland. Build your future. Be happy. Forget you ever knew me." She saw the last vestige of hope for any connection between them die in his eyes. He saw not a woman in trouble, but the same heartless creature who had dismissed him before. He nodded once, a sharp, bitter gesture. "As you wish, my lady," he said. "Farewell." He turned and walked away, his stride long and sure, toward a future that was real and solid. He did not look back. Eleonora watched him go, And as he disappeared from view, she felt the final tether to her own humanity snap. She was completely alone with the monster she had invited into her life. The final wish. Back in her barren room, she faced the truth. There was no escape. No salvation. The scroll owned her. Her life was an hourglass with only grains of sand remaining, and every heartbeat was another grain falling. A black, furious despair rose within her. If she was to die, she would not go quietly into that good night. She would not starve the scroll with empty denial. She would feed it one last, glorious meal. She would make a wish so vast, so absolute, that it would be worth the last shred of her life. She would burn out in a blaze of power that would eclipse the sun. But what to wish for? More wealth? She had it. More power? It was an empty game. To bring Roland back? It would only doom him to watch her die. The answer came to her, born of her agony and her bitter understanding. The one thing she truly, deeply wanted was the one thing the scroll had stolen from her, the freedom to want without consequence. The freedom to live. She would wish for the one thing that could possibly break the cycle. She would wish for the scroll itself to be undone. She took the tiny remnant from the casket. It was no larger than her palm, the ancient script now a dense, cramped web in its center. The rest was a void of blank parchment. She could feel the life left in her, a faint, guttering candle flame, tied to this dreadful skin. She closed her eyes, gathering the last of her will, the sum total of her desire, her ambition, her love, and her despair. She poured it all into the words, her voice a dry rasp that seemed to tear at her throat. "I wish," she whispered, "for the terms of our contract to be voided. I wish for this scroll, its magic, and all the consequences of its use, to be utterly and completely undone. I wish to be free." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the scroll erupted. It did not just shrink. It burned. A cold, black fire consumed it, spreading from the center outwards, eating the ancient script, devouring the parchment. It did not give off heat, but a terrible, absolute cold that froze the air in her lungs. It did not crackle, but emitted a high, piercing shriek that seemed to come from the very fabric of reality, a sound of unraveling. The black fire climbed onto her hand, searing her flesh with an agony beyond any physical pain. It was the pain of dissolution, of a debt being called in with catastrophic finality. She watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the last of the scroll was consumed. The black flame flickered once on her palm, and then vanished. And so did she. Epilogue. The old antiquary stood over the bed in the sparse room. The ancient maid had found her, cold and still, a look of terrible peace finally etched on her face. In her hand, clutched to her breast, was a small pile of black, feathery ash. The city magistrates called it a tragedy, a sudden fever that had taken the young heiress in her prime. They spoke of the fragility of beauty and the irony of fortune. Her estates, with no clear heir, fell into dispute among a dozen distant relatives and the crown, a feeding frenzy she would have predicted with cynical accuracy. The antiquary alone knew the truth. He collected the ashes from her hand, careful not to spill a single grain, and placed them in a small, leaden box.